What Cuba and the United States are trying to accomplish hasn't happened overnight. Indeed, no one really expected it would. Let's get some context from Eduardo Gamarra. He's a politics and international relations professor at Florida International University. He joins us live now from Miami. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
There are a lot of issues still being discussed behind the scenes, and you heard our discussion with our correspondent Michael Voss just a moment ago. What do you think are the biggest sticking points between these two nations still?
Well, many of the ones that were mentioned by the report, but clearly it's I think in the U.S. case, a lot of the, let us say, the obstacles are really domestically driven here. We're in the middle of a very complex electoral process, and as everybody knows, the U.S. Congress is still in the hands of the Republicans, which is really probably the principal obstacle to moving this round of negotiations forward. On the Cuban side, you have similar kinds of domestic concerns, and obviously the kinds of allies that Cuba has in the region are also rather skeptical about how much change has really occurred and whether the U.S. has really changed its ways.
We focus a lot on the high-level politics, but what about the people of Cuba and the United States? How will normalized relations impact them?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question because, in fact, part of what President Obama has been trying to tell people about is that what he's seeking is people-to-people contacts, and he's seeking greater, relations between organizations at the base of civil society. And that, of course, is an interesting approach, but one that is not necessarily the approach that the Cuban government wants. For example, the whole issue about how much contact diplomats in Cuba might be able to have with different civil society organizations has always been a sticking point. And that will continue to be a sticking point as long as the nature of the Cuban regime remains the same.
You've written something like 100 articles on Latin America and the Caribbean, and you've also written several books on political change in Latin America. So how significant is what's happening right now, not only on the region, but in the world?
Well, I think it's important to understand that, this is not just about Cuba and the United States. That, in fact, when you look at Cuba in terms of its size, in terms of the size of its economy and so on, it really is rather insignificant. But you have to look at this in terms of the global situation. And the reality is that globalization has kind of forced both of these countries to accept a reality, an economic reality that Cuba's not going to go very much farther, just simply depending on Venezuela for its existence. And by the same token, the United States requires of better relations with Latin America as a whole. And the real obstacle to improving relations with Latin America, and for that matter, the rest of the world, has been Cuba. So Cuba is kind of, despite its insignificance in terms of the size of its economy, it has an enormous symbolic effect for the United States.
Well, you mentioned Venezuela. There are other countries in the region that have also had strained relations with the United States, other Latin countries, Bolivia. If the U.S. and Cuba can restore diplomatic relations, do you think the same can happen with some of these other countries?
Well, I think, there's always a tendency to look at these as a package deal, but I think you have to take each one of them on their own terms. I think the main obstacle after Cuba and for the foreseeable future is going to be Venezuela, because of its economic crisis and because of the mismanagement of the economy that has gone there, and frankly because the U.S. hasn't figured out how to deal with President Maduro. And the Bolivian and the Ecuadorian cases are relatively different because both have demonstrated better management of their economy, and of course their relations with China, the fact that the Chinese economy has largely been responsible for their success, means that these two cases have really demonstrated that breaking relations with the United States or not having very good relations with the United States hasn't affected them. Now, with a slowdown in Chinese imports and so on, and the drop in the price of oil, things may change somewhat. But at least for the moment, they've demonstrated that they can move away from the U.S. and do well.
All right, Eduardo Gamarra, thank you so much for joining us from Miami.
Thank you.